Hello, welcome to Blogging Heads. I'm Tim Carney. I'm here with Mike Konczal, a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute, and today we're going to talk about jobs. So Mike, why don't you start us with the news?
Excellent. Well, thanks for having me on board. It's good to talk to you, Tim. Right now we're talking, it's Friday afternoon, 2 p.m. Eastern Time, and the job numbers have been released for the month of July, and they're starting to be digested into a format people can kind of understand. Payroll employees were up about 117,000 jobs, and total that's total jobs. Private employment was up about 150 something jobs, I think 155,000 jobs, and then public jobs, government workers, were down the difference down about 34,000 jobs. Some of those numbers, part of that's a medium-term trend of government employees being laid off, especially at the state and local level. Part of that had to do with Minnesota, which went through a state crisis, much like Wisconsin did earlier in the year, and they ended up with a lot of people laid off. So a lot of people, so those job numbers, I'm calling it kind of a frog in a pot of water kind of economy right now, because the job numbers aren't strong enough to really get us back to full employment anytime soon. It's really unreasonable. We would be under 8% unemployment by the time the 2012 elections come around. And, ideally we want to be at something like 5 or 6% unemployment or less than 5 even. And it's also, a lot of people are talking about double dips, but it's unlikely in the short term, unless something weird happens, that it gets so bad the government reacts one way or the other. So it's possible we're just going to have this long stagnation. Like I understand better why other countries like Japan have long stagnations, because it's not bad enough for the government to jump out of the pot right now, but it's also not good enough that we're actually going to get somewhere healthy in the near future.
So you're thinking if things were worse, there would be more impetus for government to do the sort of Keynesian, Krugman type massive thing that you would advocate.
Right. We can talk a little bit about what are some options about things people could do, or what there's a whole variety. But there really is a jobs crisis. I mean, the unemployment's about 15 million people. It was about 7 million when we went into this crisis, and unemployment shouldn't be zero. Obviously, a lot of unemployment is people searching for a job. It's people kind of taking some time to find the right job for them. Natural frictions, but there's no reason that has doubled in the space of a year, as we saw unemployment double in the space of a year. And there's an additional if you include people who are marginally attached, part-time workers want to work full-time, you're talking a little bit closer to 22 million people. Meanwhile, you're seeing the unemployment numbers are starting to make a little less sense as something to watch. I think a lot of economists have moved on to something called the employment population ratio. How much of the economy is actually working? And you see that that's down, and it's been down, it's steadily down. Isn't it
at an all-time low or something I saw?
It's certainly at an all-time low for a long time period. Mm-hmm. I mean, all this stuff's post-World War II data. For women, it's as low as it's been since like 1988 or so. For men, there's a bit of a longer-term decline for a variety of reasons. Then it's just plummeted in the past year or two, and it's still higher than women, but it's much lower. And so you're seeing the labor force shrink. You're seeing a lot of people who are kind of in these nebulous long-term unemployment zones where they're not really looking for a job because they don't expect to find one, but they obviously do want to work, and it would be very productive if they got back in the labor market. So, that's just not turning into any kind of political momentum. At least we haven't seen it yet, other than kind of vague discontentment that's, could be very bad for President Obama on election day.
Yep. So I've got some ideas of my own, but I want to hear and then critique yours first.
Sure. So what could the government do? Now, we can talk about how to make this applicable for Congress as it is right now, but in abstract, I think of recovery right now, what we need to do is a three-legged stool. There's fiscal policy. The government should take money and it should borrow money, and it should take it and use it to invest in infrastructure, backstop the states, do a bunch of things that we think of as Keynesian fiscal policy. There's monetary policy. The Federal Reserve can print money and buy things. It can't, because of legal constraints, it can't print money and buy labor. The Federal Reserve can't print money and buy infrastructure building, but it can print money and buy financial assets.
Yes.
We could do something like QE3. And then that's the kind of general consensus. My own personal consensus, we need to get to the bottom of the foreclosure crisis and the housing market more generally. I think massive amount of foreclosures and the real blind eye the administration has turned towards activities of the bank, towards activities of people's net wealth. It puts huge deflationary pressures on a very important market, creates a huge amount of uncertainty for investment, both from consumers taking out mortgages and people.
So you're saying the problem is that the foreclosures are driving down housing prices. That's the heart of the problem.
That's certainly a major part of it. And then there's a separate part where it's just, foreclosures tend to have spillover effects. So if you see neighborhoods falling apart, that they're falling into blight, of crimes coming, all this stuff, you're not necessarily going to want to build a brand new shopping mall in that area, right? There's actually a lot of people, this is people are trying to get their hands around this data, but family formations are down, which is a polite way of saying, or a geeky way of saying that no one's moving out of their parents' home, or everyone's moving back home. So there's starting to be a consensus that there should be a backlog of housing coming at some point in the future, and it's true, like at some point in the future we'll have to start building homes again. But the current way that all the problems in the financial sector, which go back to TARP and a bunch of other things, are delaying that. So I think some movement on housing. There's a lot of ways to do it, but I think those are the three stools, and any one of them that doesn't go into effect, or any one of them that is retreating or is being contracted, the other two have to pick up more slack.
Well, I think I probably disagree with the intermediate aims of all three of those stools. I think inflating our way out of short-term pain is what we did after a dot-com bubble, and it helped fuel the housing bubble. It's what we did out of the housing bubble, and now we've got a government bubble, which relates to the first thing you talked about trying to sort of spend our way out of it. Government, by spending money, both creating labor and creating demand, and then propping up housing prices. I mean, we did that. That was part of the problem, and there are economic benefits to falling housing prices. There are, I've got a brother, I guess a cousin-in-law who does kitchen remodeling. He loves foreclosures. As the Washington Examiner, we like them too because the government requires people to buy ads in our papers. So I guess it's crony capitalism on behalf of my employer there. But there are also other benefits of it. Becomes easier for people to buy a house because the price of housing goes down. And in some places, again, over the medium and long term, that can help stimulate the economy because people aren't pouring as much money into a house, and so they have money that they can save or invest or spend on other things. So for all the negative things you talk about, which really are negative regarding these foreclosures, there are positive things, and there are costs to propping it up. We see Fannie Mae coming and asking for more money as sort of a reminder of the fact that when government decides there's an appropriate price level for housing, or just when that appropriate price level is simply higher, that there are all sorts of economic costs. I think this might be a hard thing to talk about, in part because you're smarter on economics than I am, but in part because a lot of the disagreements are sort of foundational. But I had some ideas I wanted to throw at you that I thought you might agree with. And one is, none of these are my own, I think. One is on unemployment benefits. Liberals say unemployment benefits are good because it puts money in the hands of people who aren't working, thus creating demand. To an extent, that's true. Conservatives say this, extending unemployment benefits, it reduces the value of going to work. It's paying people to stay unemployed. And this isn't saying, all these unemployed people are lazy, they don't want a job. No, but there are costs to working. You have to, go to the dry cleaner. You have to commute. You probably have to buy your lunch at a sandwich shop more often. You don't get to spend as much time with your family. You don't get to take care of your own yard, so you have to hire someone to mow your lawn. There are all sorts of costs of being employed. A lot of people simply don't like working. Sure. And so by reducing one of the benefits of being employed, or I could just say, another cost of going to work is losing your unemployment benefits. And so you are taking away some incentive of people being sort of economically productive and going to work. So there's some depressive effect on employment from having these lengthy unemployment benefits. How it weighs with the demand effects is a question that's moot for my proposal, which is turning unemployment benefits into lump sum payments. Bam, you're laid off, you get 13 weeks worth of unemployment benefits in one check. If you can find a job in 1 week, then you're good. If it takes you 15, 20 weeks to find a job, then you're spending down your savings. Make it a bigger amount. Make it 26 weeks. That's sort of secondary to the idea that that you're no longer paying people to stay unemployed. You're giving them a benefit so that for sort of your Keynesian purposes, they can keep creating demand. For a sort of charity purpose, you're helping them not starve to death, and you're keeping them from having to just take the first job thrown at them. But on the other hand, there's a cost to staying unemployed. You're increasing the cost of staying unemployed, and thus decreasing the. In other words, that seems like an idea that sort of you could support, meeting in the middle, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. So unemployment benefits. So to give a sense, the last time I saw literature really developed on that, because it's very easy to look at, these are aggregate data, so this is a very high level view. You can look at people who are unemployed who quit their job or was fired for cause, or people who aren't eligible for unemployment and people who are. And you do a bunch of numbers, and it's probably maybe about half to 3/4 of a percentage point is related to that. So that's when people talk about structural unemployment, they talk about how NAIRU and the fundamental of the economies are changing. This is one of the big things that they're capturing is that we've extended unemployment benefits. Maybe there's about 500,000 people who would be working quicker if they under the classical theory that's what would be going on. On the other hand, there is an offset with demand, as you mentioned. There's a good study from Austria. I just pulled it up. I forgot what country it was. Where lump sum people still spend a lot of extra time unemployed. So there's two things that could be happening for why people are spending extra time. One is that is actually an economically a good thing. That you don't want a doctor to take the first job. So I actually have no problem with us really seriously re-examining unemployment insurance, and some pretty conservative economist friends of mine this crisis has really made them rethink unemployment insurance, which they were much harsher on in the past. In practice, a lot of these state level stuff is going to get devastated in the next couple of years with what we're seeing is very likely how states will readjust their budgets post crisis. But yeah, I mean, in principle, I could be for that.
Mm-hmm. And another idea I have, especially for people like you who are sort of, I think, mostly concerned about employment and about the economy and that sort of thing, is a look at a lot of these regulations that that don't apply to small businesses. Obamacare has a 50 employee threshold for the employer mandate. Mm-hmm. There are others that are 4 people threshold, whether it's OSHA rules or whatever.
Dodd-Frank, just to throw it in, Dodd-Frank looks very different if you're over 50 billion in size, and there's a couple other things like that.
Yeah, and so, but especially I'm talking about the ones that apply to the number of employees you have specifically, those double the threshold on all of them. What do these things do? They tell you, they add immensely to the cost of going from 45 to 53 employees. You're gonna pare back to keep under those thresholds. If you can run a business and not have health insurance and you have 48 people, you know that you can expand. And so maybe it's a guy who's got 2 people and would like to hire 2 more, but there's another regulation. And so those numbers are set arbitrarily. I don't know about the Dodd-Frank numbers, but the Obamacare numbers or these other thresholds as to how many employees you need to be covered by it. It's not like they're set scientifically. So if they're set arbitrarily, why not double them, triple them, make it so that more businesses can expand without there being such a penalty? Because these regulations, payroll tax, they're all penalizing people for hiring. That's not the purpose of them, but that's the effect. You're discouraging people from hiring. So as much as possible, when government policy is discouraging people from hiring, stop or reduce it or And so this is one of the things I think would help. I have no idea how much, but make it so that these small businesses can grow more than they currently can without being hit by new.
I'm very sympathetic to the anarchist critique that a lot of the problems the government has to solve are problems the government creates in the first place.
I don't think you have to use the word
so there's a lot of well, there's a couple different ways of approaching it. Or it's libertarian too, I suppose. But there is this idea. A lot of people are talking about various tax credits to hiring people, and you kind of bring up that point. It's like, on one hand, there's this penalty to hire a marginal employee at a threshold. And the government's going to solve that problem by giving them another tax loophole that some accountant has to go deal with to try to solve the first problem. In practice, I don't know if that's actually a big problem. I think the bigger problem is business formation in general. So there's this famous survey that's thrown out a lot, in part because I don't think anyone has a very strong response to it from a liberal point of view. That polls businesses on their biggest problems. And they, in general, say poor sales, which is a proxy for demand. And they ask some pretty specific questions about labor quality, about regulations, about red tape. And those have all dropped off pretty sharply since '08. So, obviously, moving those numbers around may or may not be good ideas in general. But I don't know if I would think that would... that's like the demand versus supply question, right? Because what you're saying is like, increase the supply a little bit more. Or there's some sort of government check on the supply, and the demand will come in and fill it. Where I don't necessarily think that's going to help us too much in the economy. So sorry, I'm 1 for 2 though, so that's pretty good.
And so the last one I would look at is just. You might dismiss this as just being ignored on the supply side, but government seems to favor. There are lots of policies that favor big over small business. Just the existence of bailouts, bailing out big businesses, and the sort of perpetual too big to fail status that is there.
Expanded outside of banks, because obviously banks are a kind of weird special category, but it applies to some places.
One thing is government subsidy programs are almost always require, a lawyer or being able to hire somebody. They involve more overhead. Government regulation discriminates. I shouldn't say discriminates. Government regulation will always fall heavier on bigger guys. That's why they have those exemptions for the small guys. It's an acknowledgement that adding to overhead sort of disproportionately punishes smaller businesses. And there's benefits to big businesses. They get economies of scale. They have more efficiencies. But one of their efficiencies, right, is getting more unit of production out of each worker. In other words, one of the inefficiencies of smaller businesses is that they have to hire more people to get a proportionate amount of product out. And there have been studies. The Kauffman Foundation put out studies about new businesses being responsible for 2/3 of new jobs. And so barriers to entry that are regulation or bailouts that perpetuate old businesses, or also subsidy programs that obviously often are targeted towards existing businesses as opposed to future businesses. They all favor the big and existing over the small and the nascent, and thus tilting the economy away from what I understand to be the types of businesses that are more likely to hire more.
Right. So there's a couple ways to approach it. So I tend to think of regulations, at least some of them, is basically the rules of the game for businesses. So it's like, there are ways for things ranging from how we think of property rights to how we think of distribution of losses when a business goes bad, towards what we think of as an employment contract and what kind of rights and responsibilities come with that. And to me, so like when I think of regulation, that's the first thing that comes to mind. That's probably going to put us in very different boxes right out the door. So it's weird for me to think, that what the real problem is that and then those regulations can be set very tight, and they can amplify certain outcomes over other outcomes. There is a sense in which when you have firms that have scale, when you have firms that have explicit kind of floors and ceilings put into the regulations, like as you mentioned earlier, an employee cutoff where healthcare reform changes what it does. But yeah, to me, that's still kind of like in the supply camp, where it's, the real check is that businesses can't expand fast enough as a result of some sort of government or some sort of check on the productivity that they have, either through technology or through what the government's putting into place. I think the main regulatory thing the government's doing is that it is capping the supply of money in the system where there should be more money, which is probably very different. So I'm 1 for 3, so I think that's we'll call that as a deal. But not a
so I guess the question is, I mean, do you see? You said infrastructure earlier. What would you spend money on? I mean, people talk about an infrastructure bank, and to me that just sounds. I mean, we already have these corporate welfare agencies like Export-Import Bank and Fannie Mae, which I guess is supposedly a company. But anyway, we already have these corporate welfare agencies that hand out money, and that exists. And I don't know. I mean, I don't know if you think they work. If you think Fannie Mae is good, if you think Export-Import Bank is good, I see them as cronyism, as corporate welfare, and as diverting wealth away from more efficient uses of capital. But I mean, do you see those as models for something like an infrastructure bank that people like? That a lot of the liberals are putting forward today?
Right. So there's kind of the 3 approaches. To make a quick reference to housing, to me, it's all about bankruptcy reform, and it's all about sharing losses. I don't want to spend too much time on that, but I completely get the idea of inflating the housing market as just a terrible idea, and I'm with you on that. So that's a separate argument. For fiscal policy, I mean, we can. When we talk about the most efficient use of capital, right now the market's telling us that the government borrowing money is the most efficient use of capital. I mean, if you look at interest rates, they're all-time low. I mean, that is where capital wants to go, in part because there are very few other places that it can go. Corporations are not expanding. Europe's a mess. Developing countries, I think people are had their fill. But even before that, interest rate market's incredibly low, and it's even with all this panic, it's dropped again. I don't know where 10 years are right now, but they're certainly under 3. They may even be under 2.5. So to me, that's actually where capital wants to go. And there's a lot of infrastructure that we could be doing, and the actual means of getting money from point A to point B. There is a sense, when you saw it with Obamacare, you saw it with a lot of things, where for the government to do something, it needs to give a lot of private players a cut of the action. And some people would say that that's just always true, and it's certainly a little bit more true than whatever you thought it was before in the past several years. So, but on the other hand, there's waste and there's waste. There's also waste of 15 million people sitting around who could be working. There's also waste of, not being at having, what is it? All these economic euphemisms, but, a lot of people are sitting around unemployed when they could be doing productive work. So, to me, it's funny that this whole, I'm sure you're familiar with this platinum coin thing. With I don't know if the audience knows this, but there's a rule, and maybe you can explain it better, that Treasury can print platinum coins. Treasury can't print money. That's Congress, which delegated to the Federal Reserve. But they said that the Treasury can print platinum coins of any denomination. So there was a debate about whether or not Tim Geithner, as Secretary of the Treasury, should print $1 trillion coin and solve the debt ceiling crisis. But what if Geithner printed 50, $20 billion coins and gave one to every state? Or, whatever, divide up. If he took, what do we have, 300 million? If he gave every man, woman, and child a $3,000 coin in the mail that was platinum, and it's $1 trillion, and just puts $1 trillion of stimulus in there. There's no, I get the monetary critique where you don't want to do monetary policy because it's going through this corrupt banking sector. It's all this kind of voodoo with trying to trick people about what their stock market's worth. Why isn't the Treasury just print money and then just mail it to people? I mean, what would be your objection to it? Obviously you would probably have a problem with it from a balance of power point of view. What's your more general problem with it?
It is theft to to dilute the value of everybody's dollar so dramatically. I mean, it would be this is a sort of theft, though, your idea that's not as offensive as most as Federal Reserve type inflation, because that often has the effect of the money hits the banks first, and so they get the extra money before the inflation has had the upward effect on prices. Here, it would be something of a top to bottom redistribution, because everybody would have the same amount more money, and their money would all be diluted the same amount in its value, and thus, the people who are sitting on it's basically robbing from people who have assets and giving it to people who don't, which is the sort of thing I don't find terribly morally objectionable, because I get more worked up about corporate welfare type stuff. But I think the sort of perpetual cheapening of the dollar is not a way of creating a sound foundation for the economy. I think that having a dollar of a stable value, and that means sort of averaging across sort of a bigger price index probably than the CPI, but having money that has a predictable value where you're not worrying about either Ben Bernanke or Tim Geithner going and diluting it, that creates a sort of, everybody talks about predictability and da-da-da. I think that's the most important thing to be predictable, is that a dollar should be worth a dollar. And that when politicians are going around and cheapening it, it is the height of creating uncertainty.
So I think you mentioned the CPI, so I think you know what that next objection is. But what do you mean by stable there? Because that the argument hinges on the idea of a stable dollar, and then there's an argument that a dollar now should look like a dollar in 1900. Mm-hmm. A dollar in 1900 gets you maybe like a nickel now. But then there's another argument that the dollar should roughly grow with technology and the price index. And there's another argument that there's no real neutral on a moving train here. Mm-hmm. So, right now, if the government printed a lot of money, it would distribute from savers to borrowers, mm-hmm. right? So that's the critique of inflation. But disinflation and deflation do the exact opposite. There's a lot of people who are underwater in their mortgages who can't refinance, who their inflation is less than what they paid for. Mm-hmm. Certainly over the past 2 years, and perhaps even for several years in the forward, which is straight up, theft is the word, right? But it's straight up redistribution from, people who are underwater towards Bank of America, towards rentiers, and towards people with a creditor class. So, the consistent, keeping it consistent, I think, is a good idea, right? And that's why you see a lot of people from all kinds of spectrums talking about inflation targets and talking about, having some sort of credibility commitment mechanism. But that's different than the idea that like inflation should be zero, or that the set of money should be somewhat fixed. And I think that's what separates certain types of strains.
Well, I would think that, there's different people use different definitions of inflation and deflation. For some people, inflation and deflation just means a growth or shrinking in the money supply. And sometimes it has to do with that, how prices move. So it's a money supply relative to sort of the demand for money, you could say. But in any event, kind of prices steadily going down in most things where there aren't shortages. Say, we're not talking about gasoline, or we're not talking about, let's say we're not talking about gasoline or something that we might be running out. We're running out of helium. Did you know that? We're running out of helium.
Is China eating
we're used in a lot of scientific applications. You can imagine how if you're doing something with gases and molecules, you would want the lightest possible gas. So anyway, we're running out of that. So
who are we going to invade to secure helium?
I think it would be another planet. But we need to, except for helium, most things should go down in price because we get more efficient at making them. We get more efficient at extracting the resources, at putting them together, at distributing them. So we see consumer electronics do that, but that's just because they're the only thing that's where that process is happening more rapidly than the dollar is losing value. So some people would call that deflation if kind of everything was losing its prices. And that would only become, why would it be bad if prices are going down? It would only become worrisome if, your wages were also going down. But you know what? If you were producing the same thing today that you were producing 10 years ago, that probably means, A, you haven't improved like everybody else. B, you have better technology, so you're probably a little bit lazier. And so if you're getting paid less, it's because you're actually producing less value. So as long as you keep up sort of with the rest of the economy, your pay would stay the same and wages would fall. I don't know if you would count that as deflation, but that would sort of a basically stable money supply that, say, grows with population would provide steadily falling prices in most things, except where there was material shortage and that sort of thing. So I don't see that as being harmful, as being this, this death spiral that a lot of people think it is.
But I mean, we're talking about kind of an economy-wide problem, right? Because, I mean, it is true that that's actually the whole point of, well, one of the points of why we have an economy is to, expand technology and learn how to use things better, and that's the invisible hand and all that stuff. When we're talking about it in general, what we're talking about right now is an aggregate price level, like something that represents. I mean, it's ultimately a lot of it's about wages, but a lot of it's just in general how sticky prices move. There's a couple arguments. One is that some prices don't move very well. The other is that prices moving downward, deflation, or actually causes all kinds of secondary problems that are actually very difficult to recover from. Here's not to make this 40 minutes of monetary policy, but here's several libertarians. Tim Lee, who's with has been with Cato, I think he still is, and is a tech writer, kicked it off, and a bunch of other people responded in different ways, saying that there's been a kind of movement away from what we would call monetarism, but kind of Milton Friedman style conservative economics on monetary policy, and that the right now is very nervous about monetary, just using monetary policy in general. I have a couple theories about why this might be, but when QE2 was announced last fall, Sarah Palin brought out the Ronald Reagan line that inflation's as violent as a mugger, or whatever that line is, and there's a big protest letter. Bill Kristol signed it. A bunch of other people signed it. You see liberals like Brad DeLong saying, if Milton Friedman was alive, he would explain all this, or he would be on the side of QE3. Maybe let's say that that's true for a second. Why do you see that disconnect? Because monetary policy, in some ways, was the whole Milton Friedman approach was that we can correct what Keynes found to be a problem without indicting capitalism and without necessarily expanding, and this is, of course, probably we're going to disagree, but not expanding the government as this fiscal entity.
Well, I think that I've gone about as far into the deep end of monetary policy as I can go without drowning, but so I'll answer this in a political sense, which is, we really, really don't trust government right now. We really think that at any discretion given to people like central bankers is asking for abuse. It's asking for cronyism, and it's asking for incompetence. And that as much as possible, we want those decisions to be out of the hands of regulators. So go to your favorite topic of Dodd-Frank, and people were talking about limiting the size of banks, and some people said, "Oh, if you just cap the size of a bank." I mean, that's not intelligent. That's not sound policy. That's sort of a dumb, blunt tool. And I remember thinking, hey, that sounds pretty good. I'd rather have dumb, blunt tools setting some of these limits than some genius at the Federal Reserve or the SEC setting some of these limits, because I don't trust them. I think they get captured. I think they get too much faith in their own intelligence. I think incompetence creeps in. And so I think that relates to some of the monetary policy, because the Friedman idea, as far as I understand it, involves sort of the same idea of a wise man at the lever that we've had. And that's something that I think a lot of conservatives really have just gone beyond the point that they can trust.
Right. And it's interesting because there's a lot of economists, not just conservatives, have talked about things like inflation targets and basically the Fed committing to doing something, and then that way it removes discretion. And the idea of removing discretion from the Fed has been obviously a very long project. But it's interesting because I feel like it goes more fundamental to something about political economy and how, like, beyond textbook economic stuff, that there is this kind of, I don't know, it seems like that there is the critique that a lot of conservative economists have moved to the right. And I don't want to say economists because that sounds too credentialized. Well, let's put it a different way, that a lot of intellectuals in the conservative movement, broadly speaking, so people who, think tankers, people who write, fancy policy papers and all this, have all basically taken 2 steps to the right since the crisis happened. And it's made, it's put the recovery in a very weird spot. And do you sense that? Has it just shown that we were that Bush was just too much of a compassionate conservative, and those guys got flushed out, and it seems like it's a different playing field? Or
I don't know. I mean, I find that what you're talking about happens on the politician level and the base level more. That more the types that I would call intellectuals and academics that are on the right, I find to be sort of, they feel the base and the politicians are drifting away from them. Megan McArdle is a very good friend of mine, and she supported the bailout and, stands by that decision that she, believes some sort of Keynesian thing is necessary. And so that's sort of the blogger level. She's got an MBA, so she's a lot more sort of savvy on these things than I am, and certainly than a lot of congressmen. And then you talk to economists, you look at other people, and I do think you see just as many of them sort of standing where they were standing, and the fact that you've got Michelle Bachmann and other people sort of pulling the base further away from what you were describing as Friedman or whatever is going on. And part of that is that I think a major pull to the center within the Republican Party has long been the business lobby. And I think that when you had TARP, and when you had Obamacare, and when you had the stimulus, a lot of these conservatives looked around and they said, heck, I don't think these businessmen are my friends. And obviously, of course, they all read both of my books and all my columns in the Examiner, and it helped convince these Republican business is not their friend. And so the pull to the center largely had been from the Chamber of Commerce and from Wall Street. And I don't think Wall Street and the Chamber have as much pull over the Republicans as they did pre-TARP, pre-Obamacare, and pre-stimulus.
That's actually really fascinating as kind of a policy agenda level, too. Because I think the Chamber is on board with an infrastructure ban.
Oh, yeah.
Is that right?
And they were freaking out more about a government shutdown and about the brinksmanship on the debt ceiling debate. And so, I mean, that was sort of one way of phrasing it was Tea Party versus Chamber of Commerce. But it was interesting that, that the business didn't sort of win as thoroughly within the Republican Party as normally they had.
Right. So you mentioned the debt ceiling brinksmanship, and to kind of bring us to our last topic, a friend of mine, Zach Carter, who's with the Huffington Post, wrote this big story about patent reform, the patent reform bill that's coming through that is supposedly, President Obama tells us, is going to save the economy and put 15 million people to work. And he walks through the Huffington Post. We'll put a link in the sidebar on it, but he walked through how it's basically, he calls it the spoilsman, which is a very Gilded Era explicit term, where Congress basically just mediating the spoils, who gets what out of the bounty at a high-end corporate level. And for you, that's going to be like offensive. And for me, that's offensive and doubly offensive because Congress really should be doing stuff about jobs. They're in so much as that they have spoils to give, they can give, they can rebuild infrastructure rather than taking some rents that come out of the patent markets and split that around. And he also wrote a big story right before that with Ryan Grimm all about the interchange battle, which is all about literally a battle between commercial firms and financial firms over how payments are distributed. So I was wondering if you want to talk a little bit about that. If Congress has essentially abandoned its responsibility either to do no harm in your mind or to stabilize the economy in my mind, and instead just become this Gilded Age monstrosity that's all about helping one corporation fight over one corporation.
Well, there's all sorts of things I could say about a lot of these lobbying battles that I think don't have any good side. I mean, a lot of times I'll write about some bad guy who's using his lobbyists and big government to crush somebody else who's trying to succeed in the free market. But the patent stuff you're talking about. I mean, the sort of central story, at least at the beginning of that Huffington Post piece, was about a guy who is basically the definition of a rent seeker. He created patents on how to process checks and so basically processing checks electronically and related processes, and is making banks off of this. But then on the other hand, are the banks getting a bill drafted that basically just devalidates this one patent, and it's done by Chuck Schumer, who's one of their best friends. So it's rent seekers versus crony capitalists, and I think I've characterized to you sort of Walmart versus Goldman Sachs as being, or Walmart versus Bank of America as being the interchange things on swipe fees. But one of the ways you could look at this, and I'm not saying this is the accurate way to look at it, but this narrative I think will help you understand it, is businesses. Okay, lobbyists don't just influence politicians on behalf of businesses. They also can influence businesses on behalf of politicians. And so you'll get a congressman saying to the lobbyists, hey, tell these guys, stop saying just for us to leave them alone, and tell them to come to the table. And that happens. But another thing is, these guys get milked for campaign contributions. And I'm not going to, shed a tear for Bank of America getting milked for more campaign contributions. But it is part of what's going on, is that these guys, and Dick Durbin said it on the floor of the Senate. He said that he had a lobbyist tell him at the end of this interchange debate, when we sort of did the do-over this last year, he said, I have these guys on K Street saying, thank you, Dick, give me more of these debates. This is a huge cash cow. If you've got Walmart and Bank of America and every bank and every retailer all getting together to lobby, but guess what? It's not just the lobbyists who benefit from it. Because first of all, who are these lobbyists? They're all former staffers. So the current staffers are lining up their next jobs. And then those guys then become fundraisers for the politicians, who then have more businessmen who are going to listen to them, who are going to give to their campaigns, and then who are going to end up hiring them on K Street afterwards. So part of it is a racket in which you have, if it ends up being a net zero-sum game between the retailers and the banks, the big winners are going to be the lobbyists and the Hill staff and the congressmen. Or another way of putting it, the lobbyists and the future lobbyists, and they're winning, while maybe one of the businesses will come out ahead. Often, of course, both industries end up winning somehow. The loser is the consumer and the taxpayer. But that's one important way to look at it, is that the Hill and K Street, to some extent, often are playing industry in these sort of battles.
Right. There's I forgot what it was, but one of these tax extender things. In what happened in last December when they did the tax extension, which tax cuts, and got unemployment book. There was one of these like reinvestment or like research and development. Yeah, and it's something that was like if I'm not sure on this source. Feel free to tell me if it's completely wrong. But they like extended every year or two anyway, and this just extended it. And that actually left a lot of lobbyists out to dry, because even though everyone knew that it would be extended every year, they still had to pay the lobbyists to go. And so
Obama called for a permanent extension, and that's not creating jobs; that's hurting K Street jobs there.
Exactly right. Like that was kind of interesting, because like that's actually like the only real labor thing that happened there, was that some lobbyists lost their jobs. And it's interesting. Like Michael Hart, this philosopher, has a theory that like as these battles will probably only get more intense, because he has a bigger theory about what's changing and kind of in the long term. But as we do less factory work in the United States, or as the technology matures there, that's one kind of government relationship. But as we make more stuff that is online, stuff that is idea-based, stuff that is about really, now that processes are a part of the plan now, patents are a creation of the government. And in so much as that people are going to be much more sensitive to profits coming from ideas. And, you see it with, the music industry was the very first battle of this, with the whole Napster thing and how they passed these, what I thought were absurd laws, but certainly very, very brand new kinds of laws about how to enforce these things in a criminal space and a civil space. Aaron Schwartz, who's a guy who is facing 35 years in jail because he downloaded a bunch of stuff from JSTOR.
Yeah.
I mean, like this kind of stuff. I'm curious if it's a very kind of weird question, but I can see these battles just getting more and more intense for the near future because the stakes are only going to get higher for businesses.
Yep. And the whole intellectual property thing is very interesting. And you had mentioned Tim Lee earlier. He's one of the guys I definitely follow on this, if I don't always agree with him, but he seems to basically be arguing against the idea of patents in software altogether. But there's certainly, why the Constitution explicitly allows this one, government intervention in the economy here for the sake, what's the exact wording? It's, to advance the arts and useful sciences. And so that seems to be a qualifier, right? If patents are just being used to get people rich, then they're not serving their purpose, and it's not constitutional for Congress to be doing it. But of course, you got to be ready to bear some of that cost. We might not have any prescription drugs if there wasn't the sort of pharmaceutical exclusivities and that sort of thing. But on the other hand, we know there's some abuse, and maybe the abuse is worth the benefit. But when you look at stuff like music, it's hard to see that. And the defense that they give, they'll come to these conservative meetings in the recording industry and say, look, we are a legitimate industry trying to make a profit, and we need Congress to step in and help enforce our rights. And I was thinking, the buggy whip makers were a legitimate industry, and, they had to try to figure out a way to make themselves relevant. And there are ways to protect intellectual property that don't involve so much government intervention, and that we should be, expending huge amounts of our Department of Justice to make sure that, Britney Spears can make a profit in the way that she was making a profit 5 years ago. So it's protectionist in a more accurate sense of the word. And so I agree. It definitely might ramp up. I don't know if we're going more towards an idea and knowledge-based society. Those are sort of claims I take with a grain of salt. But it certainly is something that I see on the right. More and more libertarians, especially, and conservatives too, are getting questioning some of these claims to intellectual property monopolies.
Oh, cool. Well, that puts us around 15
right.
minutes. You want to call it this point?
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Mike.
Thank you as well. Take care.